It is hot out here. Thank you for turning out. It's an enormous pleasure for me to have the opportunity to sit with Scott Turow and talk to him about some of his work, his projects, his experience here at Harvard Law School. And Scott, I'm going to start right in with your book, 1L, which has terrified generations of law students, entering law students since you wrote it. Though I have to tell you that I've been polling some 1L students, and a few admitted to me that after reading 1L, they were more excited to come to Harvard Law School. So there's still a few,
Those are the people we worry about.
of course, yes, yeah. We think about that book as being, in some ways, a book of its time, the bad old days, and that a lot has changed since then. But in rereading the book recently, there was also a lot that was still familiar. A lot of debates about the Socratic method, about being able to keep your values in law school. Have we come a long way since 1L, or when you look at legal education today, do you think there's still more that we could do?
I don't want to seem like a politician and avoid answering the question, so I will come back to it, but I just wanted to express my gratitude to Alex Whiting for doing this. We are previously acquainted. I was trying to remember exactly who first told me I had to speak to Alex Whiting, but my last novel was about the International Criminal Court, where Alex was working as a prosecutor, and he was immensely helpful, not only in giving me his own time, but also in introducing me to a wide number of people at the court. So I'm in his debt, and I'm even deeper in his debt after he agreed to do this today. So in some ways, I am the worst person to ask about whether law school has changed and how much. Certainly when I read the Harvard Law School catalog, it sounds like it's much different. I was signing books a few minutes ago, and there were a number of 1Ls who were there, and I asked each of them whether the book seemed accurate or inaccurate to them, and at least for the first few weeks, in terms of their feelings of abject terror, I think that some parts of legal education haven't changed. They're still find the language, the concentration of so many brilliant people, and the unfamiliarity of the task at hand to be pretty intimidating. So, and there are elements of legal education, yes, there's a difference between 80 and 150 students in a section, but it's still kind of a mass experience. So, I think, yes, it has changed. Certainly it's a kinder place today than it was when I was here. I was kidding last night. We were in line for dinner, and I said, the one thing I can tell you about my time here is they gave you nothing. You were lucky to breathe the same air. So the nice dinner that everyone was treated to last night was certainly not characteristic of my time here, and perhaps that's the big difference. The meals are better.
Okay, well, that's an important improvement. But you've written about some of the things that you would do if you suddenly woke up and you were the dean of the Harvard Law School. We have a terrific dean, no disrespect to John Manning. But if you suddenly became the dean, are there things that you would do based on your experience here almost 40 years ago and what you know about the school today? You were very critical in your book, so how can we do it differently?
Well, legal education is, compared to other educations in the non-sciences, it's pretty cost-effective. You have a relatively small faculty. I don't know, how big is the faculty at Harvard Law School now?
It's around 100 or so.
Okay, and so they're teaching 1,600 students. And in order to make it cost-effective, you still have, in most classes, a single exam at the end of the year, which is, kind of a weird way to to grade students' intellectual attainments in a class, but that's because you don't want to do it the other way. Now, in business school, the business school professors don't even grade the exams. So I guess law school's one up on that. But so I would like to envision a form of legal education that really treats the law as one of the humanities and deals with at least part of legal education. Yes, you've got to master the rules. Yes, you have to master legal reasoning, but something that also looks at the way legal problems are treated in other contexts, the way murder, for example, is treated in literature. It could be a much broader education, but the current demands are relatively large classes still, 80's bigger than any class I had in college, and a single exam so that you don't overburden the faculty.
There's a character in the book in 1L, Gina, who complains about feeling that law school is turning her into something that she doesn't want to be.
Right.
That she's losing something of herself.
Right.
Do you think that's still true? And is that just part of legal education, part of thinking like a lawyer that transforms you, or are we missing something? Is it that we could do?
I do think that that's inherent in legal education, and when people ask me why 1L was published 40 years ago this week, and when people say to me, why are law students and other people interested in law school still reading this book, that's what I focus on, that all law students, whether it was 40 years ago or 40 years before that or today, do experience law school to some extent as part of a crisis in identity. And the unreasoning opinions that we all held when we got to law school are challenged. And I think that's part of a rigorous education. I don't blame anybody for that. And I think that's really a valuable part of what goes on in law schools. But people do have the feeling that their legs are being kicked out from under them. And because you've got to explain everything. You have to have good reasons for it. And again, I think that's an excellent part of legal education, but that combined with the unfamiliar language that students have to master makes them feel like they are becoming somebody else.
Are there things, as you say, it's 40 years since the book was published, and you've had a career in both practice and in writing that we'll talk about more. But as you've gotten some distance from the law school and from writing the book, are there things that you criticized in the book or that you had anxieties about in the book that now, having been in practice, you think, well, actually, I see that differently?
I probably reread 1L once every 10 years. And I think only recently I read it from cover to cover. I didn't see a lot, to be honest, that I regretted saying. Now, part of that is just because it's a memoir. It's about what I was feeling and what I was experiencing. And I think with the value of hindsight, I probably value my legal education more than I did as a student because I understand the platform it provided for me. So I think that probably would be the biggest difference. But, I said what I said. I meant it at the time. And, for the most part, feeling that to some extent it can be an assembly line education. It may be harsh, and probably I wouldn't put it the same way today, but, I still think there's a fundamental truth to that.
Yeah, I agree, and I encourage people to read it if you haven't read it, perhaps after your 1L year. It has remained timely. I think a lot of the themes, as I said, that were familiar. Um, I want to kind of segue to your career as a writer. I had always assumed that it was law school that came first, and that sort of created the opportunity to write a book, and that becoming a writer came second, emerged out of law school. It actually happened the other way around, right?
True. I always wanted to be a novelist. I was an undergraduate at Amherst College, not all that far from here. And to me, for a variety of reasons, the red-banded announcement of the Stanford Creative Writing Fellowship seemed to be a sort of apogee of young writerhood. And mostly because there were so many writers whom I admired that had been Stanford Writing Fellows. And as things happened, I became a Stanford Writing Fellow and spent 5 years out there, the last 3 of which as a lecturer in the English department. And I went to law school because I knew nothing about the law. And when I found out something about the law, I thought it was really fascinating. I always joke that my father was a prophet in his own time, in the sense that he was a physician who hated lawyers long before it was common for doctors to do that. And he wouldn't let lawyers in the house, literally. So I didn't really know what lawyers did. And when I found out what they did, I thought it was amazing and frankly far more interesting to me personally. This is not a criticism of anybody else, but that it seemed much more engaging to me than academic English. And so I decided to make this U-turn, even though I couldn't quite figure out how I was going to be able to go on as a writer, which I very much wanted to do, even though I wasn't having, huge success. So, I went to law school. My colleagues in the English department at Stanford were not particularly pleased when I made that decision, but it was the right decision for me.
And can you tell us how 1L came about? Because you've described it as a kind of accident that it happened.
It definitely was an accident. I had this very forbidding literary agent at the time. I was lucky to have an agent at all, but she was kind of a crusty, older person who, because of the time difference, I tended to reach her after her 3-martini lunch, and I never could understand anything she was saying, so I figured, okay, I'm going to law school. She's been trying to sell this novel of mine with no success. I'll write her a letter. And I got into the middle of writing this letter explaining that I was going to law school, and it sounded really lame to me. So I offered the observation in the middle of the letter, and you have to bear in mind, this is before word processors, so you were much more committed to what was already on the page. And so I said, it would be great if somebody wrote a book about the daily experiences of law students. Paper Chase had already come out, but it went without saying that was somewhat dramatized. So I said, and I proposed that it'll be interesting to have somebody keep a diary for 3 years and then write a book based on that. And she went out for one of her 3-martini lunches with a man named Ned Chase, now of blessed memory. And as I always got the story, it started to rain. So after the 3 martinis, they had a bottle of wine. And by about 4 o'clock, they both had agreed there wasn't a good idea for a book anywhere in the city of New York, at which point Elizabeth remembered that she had my letter in her purse. And in their current state, Ned read the letter, thought it sounded like a great idea, and filled out a contract on the spot. And the only problem came after I wrote the book, and I sent in the manuscript, and Ned called me up, and he said, I have one question about this book. And I thought maybe he didn't like the writing, maybe he didn't like the typing, because I had a broken key on my typewriter. No, he said, I want you to remind me, why did I ever want to buy this book? So to those who wonder why 1L was published, while I was still a student at Harvard Law School, that is the answer, because once I convinced Ned that he should publish the book, I was too afraid to ask him to wait 1 year so that I could escape the withering glances of my professors and classmates.
That's a great story. So I want to pick up on something you said about your decision to go to law school, and it's something that you've spoken about in the past. It was something of a risk to make that turn, because you've talked about how you weren't sure how it would allow you to continue your writing, which was your passion, and it could have just sidetracked you off of that part of your life and that desire. But instead, it kind of made your writing possible.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very fortunate decision for me, and whatever is central to the law is central to me as a person. And so I tapped into questions about the uses of power, about finding the truth, about how to withstand the disappointment that comes from the fact that all of these systems we create in good faith always fall short. They preoccupy me as a person even to today. And so what going to law school did, not only because it launched my writing career with 1L, but also because it helped me identify what was so exciting to me in being a law student and then a lawyer. And you know, that ended up powering my fiction as well. I wrote Presumed Innocent in little tiny snatches on the morning commuter train, but I always had something I wanted to unburden myself of, which, because of my prior time writing fiction, I knew how to pump into a character's life and how to represent. And you know, it was one of the luckier breaks in my life that I had the courage to go to law school, and I went not knowing what would happen, but with this powerful sense that if I didn't do it, I was really going to regret it.
So when students and alumni look at your career, it's, you know, it's this kind of dream, amazing career of having been both a writer and a very successful practicing lawyer, and you've combined all of these interesting things that you've done in your career. And what I hear from what you're saying is that there was both an element of planning and deep desire. You've said that you wanted to be a writer since age 11, and then there's also a part of kind of willing to take risks and take chances. Can you reflect a little bit about that? And you know, for students today who are thinking about, who want to have a career that is different, who want, you know, maybe not the traditional legal career, but want to mix in an artistic element or some other kind of work. How do you think about how you do that, and taking risks, making a plan, taking risks? How do you kind of think about that?
Well, you know, when Presumed Innocent happened to me, it was like, you know, sticking my finger in an electric socket. And suddenly I'd gone from a guy writing in his basement to the author of this huge bestseller. And I became really conscious of, well, what would be the effect of this on my kids? And I always told them, I'm not sure they ever remembered it, but I repeated it, you know, don't feel obliged to emulate my career and my success, because a large part of it is based on luck, and I can't teach you how to be lucky.
But you made your luck.
I didn't. I was in the right place at the right time, both with 1L and with Presumed Innocent, because there was this growing curiosity about the law and law school. Law school applications had quadrupled by the time I wrote 1L. I think that was mostly due to Watergate. So I don't think that Presumed Innocent is a bad book by any means. I think it's a really good book, and I'm very proud to be its author. But you have to have stood in the shoes of somebody who was a writing fellow with a number of incredibly talented young writers at Stanford, and seen what happened to their careers, to to put this in perspective. And there are a lot of wonderful writers in this country writing wonderful books that just sink, into the sea. So as I said, I was in the right place at the right time, and I don't mean to diss myself as a writer, but luck is part of the game. And so that's the one caution I have to law students who want to do something different. Nobody can guarantee that you're going to be lucky. On the other hand, if you are a student at Harvard Law School, you are a really smart human being, and you can read and write really well. And frankly, those are the skills that the world really rewards. So you're never going to fall on your face. So follow your dreams, because I would think, just like what drove me to law school, the worst thing to do would be to be in later age and look back at your life with regret. If you try and fall on your face, then you fell on your face. But you won't know unless you try. So if you want to write music, write music. If you want to be a Broadway producer, then migrate in that direction. You got to do it now, because you don't want to look back and say, I wish I had done that.
You've also spoken about people from your time in law school who have pursued their passions and maybe not achieved the fame that you've achieved, but have found a tremendous happiness in life after law school, that become sculptors or someone who owned a chain of basketball courts or
Right,
right.
yes.
So is that also sort of a model for you?
Well, I have enjoyed being a practicing lawyer. Law school, at least in my time, and still to some extent today, is the famous refuge of the liberal arts graduate, which is, I really don't know what else to do. I'm a really good student. I'm good at this stuff. I'm going to go to law school. And my impression is that over the years, those are the people who are often not happy in practice, because unlike people like me who were preoccupied by the fundamental questions, they were there for a different reason. There are a lot of things wrong with practicing law, but particularly in the economic culture of legal business today. But that's not the only way to practice law. I encourage people to think about the government, being in-house in corporations, and again, for many people, being in a big corporate law firm actually is a pretty good job. So if you don't want to practice law, though, there is no stigma in that. And this education will serve you very well. I point out that all of the agents who have represented me in Hollywood are all graduates of law school, and pretty good law schools when we're at it. And there are a lot of things to do with this education besides practice law.
Okay, so let's now turn to talking about actually practicing law and your career as a lawyer. When you left the law school, you became a prosecutor, and you have said that the reason you went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago to be an assistant U.S. attorney was that you saw it as an agent of reform. Can you say something about that? And then I want to ask you whether your views about prosecution have changed over the years, have evolved or nuanced in any way.
Well, I was really lucky to become an assistant U.S. attorney in Chicago, and I had a friend who was the executive assistant U.S. attorney, and he introduced me to the U.S. attorney, and the U.S. attorney took a liking to me. And all of this happened in a few minutes, and that's how I got my foot in the door there. At that time, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago was very much what it frankly has continued to be, which is the conscience of that community. And starting with William Bauer and then Jim Thompson, they had used the mail fraud statute as a way to penetrate the endemic corruption of the Chicago political system. As I have gone on, I have realized that that's actually a bad motif for prosecution. You should prosecute people when you have strong evidence of a serious crime, and not in order to transform a city. But I did go with that view, and certainly the prosecutions I was involved in made an immense difference in the life of the community in Chicago, probably most particularly the 4 years I spent prosecuting judges and lawyers for paying bribes in the state courts in Chicago. And that's a much better court these days than it was when I became an assistant U.S. attorney. And I think the U.S. Attorney's Office is owed a debt of thanks by everybody in Chicago for that prosecution, which was referred to as Greylord.
But why do you say? I'm struck that you say that it's a bad motif. To change a corrupt culture in a city, why shouldn't prosecutors aim to do that? Is it because that motif leads them to abuses because it's too big a mission, or is it that it's not the right way to do it, or that it inevitably fails, or why have you moved away from that motif?
Well, I think that prosecution and politics are a very bad mix. And as I said, if you start looking for cases just because you think that they have more value in changing the landscape of the city or the county where you're working, I don't think you're doing your job in the right way. You need to look at cases where the evidence is strong and the crime is serious. And because the worst thing that happens, frankly, is that you start targeting particular defendants. The Organized Crime Strike Force, which worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office during my time in Chicago, was a lot of great lawyers, but they were determined to prosecute mob figures, and they decided who the defendant was going to be and then went looking for the evidence. And that's overall really wrong-headed. It doesn't work the way it should work.
You also had later in your career you worked on death penalty in Illinois. You did some very important work on that, and on some cases where there was egregious prosecutorial misconduct. And you've written about how that experience, that work, that you, having been a prosecutor, you could understand the dynamic of that misconduct and how prosecutors can fall into that misconduct. But it also changed in some way your view of the prosecutorial function or of prosecutors.
Well, there is no substitute for good faith, and you have to be sensitive as a prosecutor and very much aware of the extraordinary power that you are wielding. I do often look back and say, I was 29 when I started as a prosecutor, and I had incredible power over people's lives, and I probably was too young to have that power. I didn't understand, and probably no prosecutor does till he or she gets on the other side, the incredible cost to the people I was investigating, even when they don't get indicted. Bad prosecutors are really bad figures in public life because they have such great power, and there is no substitute for a strong ethical culture in a prosecutor's office. And adhering to lines and having people like my supervisor, Jim Stryker, who told me when I was a young prosecutor, he says, "You want to know what my definition of Brady material is?" I said, "Well, okay, well, Brady material is the evidence that's supposed to be turned over constitutionally to the defendant." He said, "Is it going to bother you? Is it going to hurt your case to turn this over?" And we were talking about a particular piece of evidence. I said, "Well, yeah." He says, "Then it's Brady material. If it bothers you, if it hurts to turn it over, it's Brady material." And he was insistent that was my obligation. And nobody ever gave me a break in that office on those requirements. And there are offices where that doesn't happen. And certainly the cases of Alex Hernandez and Rolando Cruz that you were talking about involved the most horrifying misbehavior by prosecutors that I've had any personal contact with. And, just literally efforts to frame these defendants. And I actually didn't believe prosecutors could behave like that. It was not only appalling, but it just sort of tore my heart out by the roots. But, there are good prosecutors and bad prosecutors, good offices and bad offices. And, and that's the truth.
So just to pick up on that last thing that you just said there, there are a lot of students who think about, whether to be a prosecutor, whether to do defense, whether to do a different area of law. Is it possible to do good as a prosecutor today?
Yeah, of course. Again, if you exercise your discretion wisely, prosecute, again, serious crimes with strong evidence, you're doing what you should be doing. And there are a lot of tough decisions as prosecutors, but and you have to get used to that. But make them in good faith, and you'll be fine. That said, though, the fact that there can be bad prosecutors or good prosecutors who occasionally make bad judgments go to emphasize the importance of the role of defense counsel. I hated defense lawyers until I became one because I saw them as simply in the way. Their job was to thwart and delay me in my job to send a really bad person to the penitentiary. And, a lot of what a defense lawyer does is just that, to try to misdirect the whole process. But that's a really valuable function, and you put the government to its proof. You keep the bad prosecutors from misbehaving, and I have a lot of respect for defense lawyers. Of course, I've been one now for more than 30 years.
As we've said, you've had this, interesting practice. So you've prosecutor defense. You've worked on commissions. You've worked in a firm. You've kind of worked on your own. Is there a law job that you wish you could have done or still do?
Well, like most assistant U.S. attorneys, I often would envision myself as a federal district court judge. And I had, most of the time when I was finishing Presumed Innocent, I took a summer away from the law, and I had no idea of what was going to happen with the book. But I came in one day from exercising, and I was in the shower, and I had this vision, it's going to be a huge bestseller, and it's going to be a movie. And I suddenly said to myself, well, if that happens, you'll never be a federal judge. And then I thought to myself, okay, I'll take that deal. So, I've flirted with going on the bench for years, but, at this stage in my career, I don't think it's going to happen. But, yeah, I would have loved to have been a judge.
So I'm gonna turn now to ask you some questions about your most recent book that you've already alluded to, Testimony. Before I do that, I'm gonna just tell the crowd here that after that, I'll open it up to some questions, and Paul here has a microphone. So if you think you might have some questions, get ready to raise your hand, and we'll field them. But I wanna talk about this book, Testimony, a terrific new book which is available for sale. I don't know if you'll still sign some books afterwards. I highly recommend that you buy it. It's a great read. And as you alluded to, we talked about the book. You called me up and you said the book is going to be about an American prosecutor who goes over to the International Criminal Court. And there was kind of a pause, and I don't know if you remember you saying this, that you said this. You said, but it's not going to be based on any real person. As though you could read my mind. Right?
'Cause that's what Alex was at that point.
Yeah, I had about 10 seconds of thinking that Scott Turow was going to write a book about my life, right? So can you talk about this book? Are you first tell us a little bit about what the book is about. Give them an idea, and then is this a different book for you? A different kind of book? Were you trying to do something different in this book?
Testimony is about Bill Ten Boom, the former U.S. attorney in my imaginary literary homeland of Kendall County, whose life sort of falls apart at the age of 50 and is persuaded by a law school chum to go to the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague in Holland, to pursue the investigation of the disappearance of a refugee camp of 400 Roma, that is, gypsies, during the final days of the American peace enforcement effort after the war in Bosnia. And how that came together is kind of a long story, but it really reduces itself to two stories. I was in The Hague in the year 2000, and I went to a reception at the house of the American ambassador in The Hague. And there were, especially in those days before the ICC, lots and lots of American lawyers working in the various criminal tribunals that the UN had established in The Hague. And I found myself surrounded by 5 or 6 people who were saying, "No, you got to write a book about this place. You know, the cases are amazing, the diplomatic intrigue, the backcourt or politics, personal lives tend to be a little twisted because so many people are away from home." And usually when people tell me that I've got to write a book about something, there's this terrible injustice, and I've got to write about it, and it, commands public attention. They're talking about their divorce. But this sounded a little more promising, and I always held on to the idea. And the other thing is, for many, many years, I had wanted to understand more about the Roma, the gypsies, who do things often that seem counterproductive to me. And I always tell the story about the first time I thought about this. I was in a hospital where the Roma had stolen all the ashtrays. And it was like, why would you do that in a hospital where you know that you or your loved ones have to come back there at some point, and you want them to welcome you, not, bar the doors? And I promised that I would come to understand them. And so about 5 years ago now, when I got ready to finally write this book about the International Criminal Tribunals in The Hague, by then the ICC was well established, I thought, the Roma. The victims of this crime are going to be the Roma. And those were the starting points.
And you did an enormous amount of research for this book. You traveled to The Hague a couple of times. You traveled to Bosnia. You watched a lot of trials from your home.
From afar, right.
From far away, from Evanston. And how did you end up thinking about this project of international criminal justice? As you sort of first saw it from far away as a prosecutor, you then got close to it and really dug deep and learned how it works and met a lot of people. You could come away feeling discouraged. You could come away feeling encouraged. How did the experience of writing the book change or shape your views about international criminal justice?
Well, I don't know if I can speak about international justice.
Or the court, the International Criminal Court.
But I came away with enormous respect for the mission of the ICC. And I'm at pains to point out to people that the United States, ultimately after 9/11, After being an immense proponent of the court, there was a change in administration and a change in policy. And we became opponents of the court and essentially withdrew our prior signature on, on that treaty. And that was a bad mistake, I think, for the United States. And the example I give is with Syria. Once the world's most powerful and in many ways still the most respected nation in the world said we're not playing the game, then there were other nations, like Syria, for example, that also refused to ratify the treaty. And so now we have mass atrocities taking place in Syria. And instead of being able to say to Mr. Assad, we are coming for you. There will be a day when you will answer for all of this in front of the International Criminal Court. We're stuck with minor gestures like, potholing an airfield with bombs. And Assad continues, and, there are thousands of refugees and, hundreds of thousands of deaths. And I would rather see the ICC strong and operating with the full support of this country.
The book is like many of your books. It's thrilling and it has twists and turns, which I won't give away, and it's a real page turner and a terrific read. There's also a lot that educates the reader about the court and the things that you've just been talking about right now. Was that different in this book? Did you want to bring knowledge of this court and this enterprise and the work that it does to your readers in that way, in a different way than some of your other books?
Well, the burden of writing this book is that there's an awful lot to explain. And it's not like setting a novel in the Kendall County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, which people are familiar with. And, I didn't want to shorthand things so that I was terribly inaccurate. And I'm sure I made many technical mistakes anyway. But on the other hand, I've always accepted the advice that Darryl Zanuck supposedly gave one of his writers, which is, if you want to send a message, use Western Union. A novel is meant to be a novel. It's to, enlighten and entertain. And so I don't care if you are for the ICC or against the ICC by the time you're done reading testimony. I just wanted to represent that world with some degree of verisimilitude.
Okay, I'm going to open it up here to see if there are questions from the audience. Please raise your hand high if you have a question. I'm looking around. I see a question here in the front. Phoebe has a question.
Mr. Turow, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. I am, as a law student, in awe of those who can make a professional career in writing. And from what I've heard from other professional writers, even ones who've had decades of success, the process of writing can be both liberating and agonizing. In some cases, they are their harshest critics. So I'm wondering if that's the case for you, and if so, how you cope with that.
I have lots of writer friends who describe writing as agonizing, and for the life of me, I don't understand why they do it. I certainly have days when I'm unhappy with my inability to connect thoughts and feelings with words, and that is frustrating, but I know that eventually I'm going to get it right, or at least righter, and that I'm going to feel great about it. And for me, when things are going really well, like there's a scene in Testimony where Boom is captured and held on the top of a saltwater tower, and I was high all day writing that scene. So there are moments when you feel like you're using all of yourself everything you know, all of your experiences, everything that you've learned from the years of writing before, and it's a great high. So, I recommend being a best-selling novelist to everyone.
Now you work part time, so you have time to write. But you were also writing when you were practicing as an assistant U.S. attorney full time. What was your process? How did you manage to fit writing into a busy life?
Well, I think it's funny, looking back, I had great teachers, but much of what I remember was the most practical advice. And the great American novelist Wallace Stegner was one of my teachers when I was a fellow at Stanford. And Wally always said that you have to write every day. Sometimes it's not a good day, as Phoebe was talking about, but you have to at least give the muse a chance to visit. And while I was in AUSA, I was writing for 30 minutes on the morning commuter train. That's all I was doing, but it was enough to keep the gears greased. And but it's a job. Being a novelist is a job like every other job, and you got to do it every day.
Other questions?
Where did you ever get the horrible idea in your sequel to Presumed Innocence of an appellate judge having an affair with a law clerk?
Well, Innocent, which is the sequel to Presumed Innocent, is basically written to the notion that some people cannot keep themselves from repeating the same mistakes. And certainly that's what happens in Innocent with Rusty Savage. I think I've got one more book about Rusty in me. And
Oh, that's great news.
but I don't, somebody, I got a fan letter the other day, and this fan said, "Is Rusty happy now? Is he happy? Has he learned anything from all of this?" And I wrote him back, I said, "I just don't know right now. So when I answer that question, I'll be ready to do this third book."
Oh, that is really great news. That's the best news I've heard all day. You have written about how your books are about abuses and uses of power, and also about identity. Is that a theme throughout all these books?
It seems to be, and I really understand the roots of my obsession with power and seeing it used fairly, and I have no clue why I am so obsessed with identity. And yet you can look at a book like Testimony, you can look at a book like Ordinary Heroes, which is an earlier novel I wrote set in Europe, and see identity as just a gigantic theme. And yet, I'm 68 years old. I feel pretty comfortable in my own skin. I think I know who I am. So I can't exactly explain where it's coming from, but it's coming from somewhere.
Okay, I'm going to see if there are any more questions out here in the audience. Any more? Oh, yes.
All right, last question.
Last question. It's up here in front. Yeah, we're hot up here.
Hi, my name is Molly. Thank you so much for being here. My question is, continually, you're a practicing lawyer and you still write, and I guess what do you get from law that you don't get from writing, and how do they continue to inform each other?
Well, when I was here, Professor Charles Freed wrote an essay that I've always borne in mind, and the title of it was The Lawyer as Friend. And as a lawyer, you have an opportunity to make a direct impact in the life of other human beings. And that's true, by the way, even when you're representing corporations, because the person at the end of the phone is still a human being who's got a problem and is asking you to solve it. And that's a privilege. Somebody says, "Help me," and you're able to help. That's different than writing a book that's addressed to a large but faceless audience. So there's a lot of gratification in the practice of law. Alex, thank you.
Scott, thank you for coming back 40 years later and sharing your thoughts about your career, your writing, about the law school. Really terrific to have you here.
Thank you.